today's chief guest and the main speaker, Professor Jatindra Kumar Naik, Professor Shubha Chakravarti, K.P. Ramanuni, dear colleagues and friends, a hearty welcome to all. Today, this is the second program of this year's commemorative lecture series. The Vaikam Muhammad Bashir Chair of the University of Calicut and the Department of Malayalam are honored with the presence of Dr. Jatindra Kumar Naik today. Professor Jatindra Kumar Naik, former professor of English, Utkal University, Odisha, to speak about the Oriya fiction. With great pleasure, I welcome you, sir. Professor Jatindra Kumar Naik is a well-known translator, literary critic, columnist, editor, and educationist from Odisha. He has translated several books of Odia literature into English, and today he is going to speak about the fiction in Odia literature. I once again welcome you, sir, to this online lecture. I invite Professor P.P. Ravindran, visiting professor of the Bashir Chair, to preside over the function. Thank you.
Please unmute yourself.
I'm sorry. I was just mentioning that we have had this meeting in this series yesterday, where Professor Rajendra Chenni he spoke about Kannada fiction, and as part of that, we had in fact explained in some detail the sense in which someone has I think the mic could be muted. There is a lot of disturbance in some. Thank you. I was suggesting that this is a series which aims to present Bashir in the context of Indian fiction. Bashir is not to be studied in isolation, is not to be looked at in isolation, but is to be read in a proper Indian context. Because Bashir's vision was not limited to a local area, though he is sometimes regarded as a regional writer, a writer who focuses on a particular aspect of Kerala culture. I don't think that is the way in which we have to look at great writers like Bashir. And this was what we explained in some detail yesterday. Now today, as part of this, we are going to have a lecture by Professor Jatindra Kumar Naik. He has already been introduced by Professor Divagaran. I would just add to this that he is currently very active in literary work. He is an active translator. He is a translator of such classic novels as Fakir Mohan Senapati's Cha Mana Atha Guntha, and translator of such important Odia writers as Chandra Shekhar Rath and Tarun Kanti Mishra, and several others. And he is also, as he was explained just now, he is also associated with the India Foundation in Bengaluru. He was visiting professor at Ravenshaw University, IIT Bhubaneswar, Center of Excellence in Language and Literature, Utkal University, and Ashoka University. He edits Mag Asia, a journal devoted to exploring Asian literatures and cultures. His translations have appeared under the imprints of University of California Press, Oxford University Press, Penguin Books, etc. So a very, very active writer, a very active scholar. I'm very happy to have Professor Jatin Naik here with us today to give this lecture on Odia fiction. Thank you, Professor Jatin Naik.
May I begin?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Okay. So, needless to say that I am delighted to be here today. I thank Professor Divakaran, Professor Rabindran for inviting me to talk about Odia fiction, and I feel truly honored to be associated with an event which marks the occasion of the death anniversary of a great writer like Bashir. And I have a special connection with Kerala because this event reminds me of an article I wrote long back in 1979, I think. Professor P.K. Rajan, who is sadly no more, published my article on Odia fiction, the Odia novel. So in Litcrit, which I don't know if this magazine is being published today, but in those days, it used to come out regularly, and I published an article on the Odia novel, which much later he included in a volume titled The Growth of the Novel in India, and the introduction to this volume was written by the great critic K. Panikar. K.M. Panikar, the famous...
It must be Ayyappa
Panikar. So he wrote the introduction. So I have very fond memories of. So 46 years later, I have been asked again by a university in Kerala to reflect on, to talk about Odia fiction. So it's a wonderful coincidence. And I have many friends in Kerala. And I'm very happy to be here today. And I'll try my best to give a very broad idea about Odia fiction, its origins and the way it developed and the directions it took. But largely, I would focus on its origins and certain trends that it displayed. And I will certainly benefit from my knowledge of, or if I receive enough information about the way the novel as a literary form emerged in other linguistic communities in India. So, like Professor Rabindran rightly said, we shouldn't look at the rise of the novel in India in isolation. It's a pan-Indian phenomenon. Each language perhaps has certain specificities, but I think the history should be looked at from an integrated, comprehensive way. So while focusing on the rise of the novel in Odisha in the 19th century, particularly in the late 19th century, I will also talk about the influences the novelists observed, the kind of encounters they had with colonialism. So broadly, I think that I'm talking about a pan-Indian phenomenon without knowing much about it. I'll be focusing on the Odia novel, but I'm sure there are many this is shared heritage. And what I say about Odia fiction may perhaps illuminate aspects of the rise of the novel in other parts of the country. So, like in many other parts of the country or many other parts of the world, I think the literary traditions were dominated by poetry, dominated by imaginative fiction of a kind which is very different from the modern realistic novel. So it was in the 19th century, late 19th century, that prose in Odisha came to establish itself as a medium of expression towards the middle of the century. Because before that, poetry was the most dominant means of expression. So there are certain factors, there are a number of factors. One is, of course, the translation of the Bible and the introduction of Western education or English education, which broke with the earlier methods of imparting instructions, which focused heavily on poetry. So the missionaries translated the Bible into Odia. Of course, they used prose, a very convoluted, very, very stylized prose, so not very accessible to the ordinary people, but they introduced prose as an important medium of expression. And they also set up schools and started introducing textbooks, which again used prose as a medium. They were trying to introduce secular subjects like geography, like biographies. So they again used prose extensively. But I think we have to wait for 1866, that period when prose came to be used much, much more extensively. And this turning point came in 1860s, late 1860s, because in 1866, Odisha was devastated by a terrible famine. And nearly 1/3 of its people perished. Odisha was occupied by the British in 1803. And for about 63 years, Odisha was subjected to a terrible administrative system, a land revenue system. They didn't do much about spreading education. There was a lot of resistance to British rule in the beginning. And then the communication system was also horrible. So it culminated in all these combined to culminate in a disaster called the 1866 famine. And as I have already mentioned, nearly 1/3 of the population perished. But this constituted a turning point in the history of Odisha in the sense, suddenly the tiny minority of educated Odias, people who had received some Western education, there were no colleges. The first the college in Odisha was established in 1868. So whatever little education they had received in schools, whatever little Western education, that now motivated this small minority of members of the emerging Odia middle class to invest heavily in print culture. Earlier, print culture was associated with the missionaries, and people were afraid of touching even paper because they thought that they would lose their religion, they will become Christians. But gradually, with the spread, however narrow, with the spread of Western education, the members of the Odia middle class overcame the resistance to the print culture. And the first Odia newspaper called Utkal Deepika, the lamp of Odisha, was brought out in 1866, the same year the famine ravaged Odisha. So the first newspaper was published, and soon afterwards, people started printing ancient Odia literature and textbooks, because with the spread of education, because out of guilt now the British officials started setting up schools. Soon afterwards they also introduced Odia in schools and colleges and the kacharis, the courts, law courts. So now I think the schools became the cradle of a kind of awakening. The schools and the textbooks. There was a huge demand for textbooks. So most of our early writers were actually writers of textbooks. All are great writers. I'm sure this must be the case in some other parts of the country, but at least in Odisha, most of our writers, those who distinguish themselves as writers of plays, writers of drama, writers of novels, writers of short stories or essays, began their career as writers of textbooks, because there is a huge demand for school textbooks. And the schools became the cradle for critical discourses, because that's where, again, prose became the most important medium of instruction. So these two things happened. One, the publication of the newspaper, which started articulating the grievances of Odias by a tiny minority of Western educated Odias, and then the expansion of school education, which led to the increased demand for textbooks. So most of our writers, like as I just said earlier, began as writers of textbooks. And in these textbooks, people started trying to transform the sensibility of the emerging middle class. Because the education that was provided now to school children was secular in character. And literature now emphasized knowledge, content rather than form. Grammar was pushed to the background. It's new knowledge that was circulated, that was disseminated through textbooks. And some of our great writers began as translators. They translated these textbooks. For instance, Fakir Mohan Senapati, who played such a critical role in shaping literary sensibility in Odisha, Radhanath Rai, Madhusudan Rao, all these great writers, they started their careers as translators. They translated textbooks from Bangla. They started translating literature from the West and introduced these in schools. Fakir Mohan Senapati, for instance, translated Jivana Charita or Charita Mala by Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar to be prescribed in schools. And in the introduction he wrote to that translation, he says something very significant, that these biographies are aimed to reduce people's dependence on fate. People who no longer, after reading the lives of these people who rose to higher levels of existence through hard work, will motivate people not to depend on fate and will depend on hard work, on developing their individuality. So these translations also played a key role in introducing a new sensibility. And then writers like Radhanath Rai, they were also heavily steeped, deeply steeped in Western literature. So they started introducing Western literary texts through very deft manipulations. For instance, they wouldn't say that it's a translation, but they would translate Seas of Corinth or Agamemnon, write poems based on Atlanta's race. So all these Western literary models were imported into Odia literature very cleverly. And even in school textbooks, they translated essays, English essays into Odia and introduced this new literary form. For instance, there is one essay in 1880, they published, or they prescribed a textbook which was written by Madhusudan Rao, an acolyte of Radhanath Rai, and a highly educated person, who was a school inspector, school teacher, and a great poet. He was a Brahmo. So he introduced the essay as a literary form. Radhanath Rai had already done that, but at the school level, he introduced essay as a literary form and published a collection of essays titled Prabandha Mala, collection of essays. And there, one of the essays was titled Ramayana and the Iliad. And this was prescribed for school students. And the collection of poems which was prescribed introduced many translations, one of these being The Solitude of Alexander Selkirk, written by William Cooper. But Madhusudan Rao translates it into Odia and presents it as an original poem. So Western influence started seeping into Odia literature through these translations and adaptations. So this is how a new sensibility was beginning to transform Odia literature through translation, through adaptations, through the interventions of missionaries. And the point I was trying to make was that prose was emerging through journalism, through textbooks, through translations as the chief principal medium of expression. So novel as a literary form was new. So there weren't any example. Before that, people had folk tales, fairy tales, romances. There were certain prose narratives. For instance, there is this famous prose narrative, Prastab Chintamani, written in the 17th or 18th century, but these are actually romances featuring princes, featuring kings, featuring princesses. So they were novels in the strict sense of the term. Novels as we now know them, they are very different from them. So we have to wait until 1888 to witness the emergence of, or the arrival of, the novel as a literary form. Novel as we know it, at least social realistic novels. But the first Odia novel was a historical romance written by one Umesh Chandra Sarkar and published in 1888. So the first novel was a historical romance. Obviously, in the neighboring state of Bengal, Bankim Chandra had already become very famous for writing historical romances, historical novels, and this writer was certainly inspired by that example, and perhaps their exposure to Western literature, writers like Walter Scott, it's perfectly possible. The first Odia novel is Padmamali, named after the heroine, the female protagonist of the narrative, and it was published in 1888. And here you can see certain tendencies that will be developed more fully in later realistic novels. Here, of course, there is a story of love at first sight. And again, the local king falls in love with the daughter of an ordinary person, rescues her from a villain. But so apparently this is a love at first sight narrative. And there are elements of wish fulfillment that it ends in the union of the lovers. So obviously it contains elements of an ordinary romance, which, as I just mentioned, carries wish fulfillment elements. But there are significant differences from earlier romances. What are those differences? I think the most important difference is the conflict in the novel begins in a festival in a temple, but it's resolved at the end of the novel in a British law court. So already elements of a realistic novel have been introduced, that the conflict is no longer resolved by deus ex machina, or by divine intervention, or by sudden change of heart that we find in romances, but in a British law court. So already the presence of the colonial power is recognized, that you can't allow these flights of imagination, flights of fancy to control the shape of the narrative. The other important thing is that certain considerations are recognized, certain real life considerations are recognized, something that we don't find in romances. For instance, this prince, the king, falls in love with the daughter of this ordinary person. And suddenly he develops qualms, scruples. Is there any precedent of a king marrying the daughter of a commoner? So it's no longer love at first sight. It is subjected to considerations which relate to an ordinary world, day-to-day, mundane world. But the third most important thing is, element in this first Odia novel, is the presence of a narrator, very important kind of narrator. This narrator is a garrulous narrator. This narrator is a digressive, intrusive narrator, something that you don't have in ordinary romances. So this narrator is constantly intruding upon the narrative, trying to negotiate between the reader and the characters. And one can easily see that the readers are no longer willing, the narrator has realized that the readers are no longer willing to suspend their disbelief, like when they read a fairy tale or a romance. So this newly educated readership, of whom the narrator is deeply aware, they are not willing to suspend their disbelief. They have to be convinced of the probability of incidents, convinced you cannot strain their credulity, you can take them for granted. So a highly self-conscious narrator is trying to convince the readers that they are reading something which is not a romance, not a fairy tale, not a folk tale. That the world the narrator is introduced into them is a world governed by cause and effect, and is a credible world. So this is a very important development in the history of Odia fiction. Introduction of this garrulous, self-conscious narrator who no longer takes the readers for granted, and the readers are, of course, obviously unwilling to suspend their disbelief. So this is a very important development. It's not a very well written novel, it's not carefully constructed, but this point, I think, was made more vividly and convincingly by Professor Amiya Dev when he talked about Fakir Mohan Senapati's Chamana Atagund, about which I'll talk a little later. Then the novel that follows this is another historical novel and is more visibly influenced by Bankim Chandra, Anand Math. This novel is again named after the heroine, Vibhasini. She's a widow. And this novel is set in the period of Maratha rule in Odisha. Maratha rule preceded British rule in Odisha in the second half of the 18th century. So Maratha rule is remembered as a time of misrule, time of oppression, tyranny. So this novel is set there in that novel and talks about a rebellion against the oppressive Maratha rulers. So obviously it has some resemblance. It bears resemblance to Anand Math written by Bankim Chandra, where sannyasis rebel against British rule, and there is a wonderful resolution of that conflict, and everyone knows about Anand Math. So this novel was inspired and influenced by Anand Math, but again, you have a self-conscious, garrulous narrator. The narrator is constantly negotiating between a contemporary reader who has received Western education, is not superstitious, is not willing to accept a fairy tale-like situation, and the characters. So the narrator is constantly moving back and forth between the past and the present, and conscious of the demands of a Western educated readership of the present time. So this is again another advance upon the earlier historical romance, earlier historical novel Padmamali, about which I just talked for a bit. But a fully formed, or you can say fully developed work of fiction, prose fiction, we find in 1897 when Fakir Mohan Senapati writes or publishes Chamana Atagund, 6 acres and a third. This again doesn't emerge from a vacuum. You can see that it's again deeply influenced by remarkable or famous predecessors. For instance, one can see in it the influence of Bankim Chandra's Vishabrukhya, The Poison Tree, but it's more directly influenced by an English novel, Govinda Samant or Bengal Peasant Life. Fakir Mohan Senapati wrote a fascinating autobiography where he talks about he's an autodidact, received very little formal education, perhaps went to school only for 2-3 years. But he's an autodidact, taught himself Persian, taught himself English, taught himself, of course, he knew Bangla, Sanskrit. So this autodidact, self-educated writer, he wrote, he in his autobiographies mentions that he read the Bible, the Robinson Crusoe, and Bengal Peasant Life by Reverend Lal Bihari Dev. So there are distinct affinities with this novel, which talks about a poor peasant called Govinda Samant and how his life is completely destroyed by certain colonial policies. And Fakir Mohan Senapati models Chamana Atagund on this novel, Govinda Samant or Bengal Peasant Life, and borrows elements from Bankim Chandra, but creates something that is completely new, strikingly different from the models he had used. So how is it different? Or how is this novel different? I will talk at length on Chamana Atagund because this presents a turning point in the history of Odia fiction. There are other turning points, but this casts its shadow over the later history of Odia fiction and remains an iconic text even today. So the first thing is that it's remarkable in giving the novel, its narrative, a very strange title. A Plot of Land is the title of this novel, when the tradition was to either use the name of the heroine the name of the hero like Govinda Samanta, Padmamali, or a monastery like Anandamatha. But here, a precisely measured piece of land is the title, gives the novel its title. 6 acres and a third. So this shows that Fakir Mohan is preoccupied with man's changing relationship to land under colonial rule. Land here is not seen as soil, earth. For instance, in House for Mr. Biswas, B.S. Naipaul talks about laying one's claim to a portion of the earth. Fakir Mohan is not interested in that earth. Or do bigha jameen, or not like that. For Fakir Mohan, land is a commodity, a sellable commodity. For the first time, land has become a sellable commodity in colonial Odisha. Man's relation to land has changed. It's no longer an intimate relationship. So today you own a piece of land, tomorrow under changing circumstances you'll become landless. So this changing relation to land is the protagonist of the novel. So the entire novel is about man's changing relationship to land as property under colonial rule. So the British dispensation had introduced new revenue laws, new economic laws, new land property laws, and suddenly land has become a commodity. So this novel is generally used, read as a moral fable in which a greedy, acquisitive zamindar takes away the piece of land owned by a poor weaver couple and finally perishes. But this is not the case. If you read the novel carefully, this novel is about a series of displacements. Series of displacements that were taking place under colonial rule. The land of the Jamindari passes from the hand of the traditional landowners, and then it passes in the hands of a Muslim horse trader. Then it passes in the hands of a moneylender, Odia moneylender, and finally into the hands of perhaps non-Odia lawyer. So you can see the transition. So he's dramatizing a great transition that was overwhelming people's life, particularly the Odia peasant's life. So this novel is actually talking about the emergence of the isolated economic man, which we find in Robinson Crusoe, which Fakir Mohan says he had read in his autobiography. He says that he had also read Robinson Crusoe. So man as an isolated, so human beings being reduced to isolated economic men. So in this novel, like as I just said, Professor Amyadev talks about the important narrator, narrator plays a very important role in this novel. He's constantly trying to tease the reader, treating the reader as an adult. It's no longer a story being told. It's no longer what happens next. He's talking about a profound historical change taking place and completely transforming human lives, reducing them to destitutes. The whole agrarian order is disintegrating, and this narrator is constantly trying to manipulate the reader's response to this great or this momentous transition from one order to another. And humor plays a very important role in this novel. Irony plays a very key role in this work of fiction. And you have very important epigraphs. The chapters carry epigraphs. For instance, all this is how brilliantly he presents this transition, how this transition is embodied in these epigraphs. So in one chapter, he gives this epigraph, Banijye Vasate Lakshmi, Tadardham Rusikarmani. This is a Sanskrit saying that commerce brings prosperity, and half of this prosperity is ensured by agriculture. And this he mischievously mistranslates, deliberately mistranslates. He says Banijye Vasate Lakshmi, Tadardho BL pass. If you pass Bachelor of Law degree, then you earn half of this prosperity. So commerce can bring you a lot of prosperity. Half of this prosperity can be now earned by becoming a lawyer. So this novel is saturated with references to the emerging legal system. Lawyers, there are 21 references to cases, lawsuits, mamlas. 21 references to lawyers, law courts. So the whole action shifts from the country to the city. It begins in a village and ends in a law court, in a British law court, where the greedy moneylender, this acquisitive individual, is sentenced to 6 months imprisonment and is beaten by his fellow prisoners and dies. So at one level, it functions as a moral tale, but at another, it actually dramatizes the transition, dramatizes a series of displacements that was leading to the disintegration of the agrarian society under the impact of colonial rules, especially the new legal system, which was based on, as I told you, a new revenue laws. So in Fakir Mohan, we find this, and in other novels also we find this narrator constantly trying to, for instance, at one point, through a series of allusions, he tries to dramatize this transition. He says, it took only as much time one needs to buy and sell a donkey to change the ownership of Bengal Subedari. So constantly these allusions link the loss of this, or the misappropriation or the expropriation of this poor weaver couple to the process of colonization. It comes to Kohinoor. For instance, at another point it says that, well, whoever took the Kohinoor diamond suffered. But now it adorns the neck of the British Queen. So now this lawyer will take this zamindari, will not suffer because it's British educated. So all these ironic statements establishes parallels between various kinds of dispossession. That not only a poor peasant is being dispossessed of his small parcel of land, all people of India are being dispossessed of their country through the process of colonization. So it's an anti-colonial allegory at one level. Fakir Mohan goes on to write 3 more novels. One of them is a historical novel, which again talks about Maratha misrule in Odisha. But the other 2 novels continue this narrative, extend this narrative, which unfolds in Chamanatagam. So the rise of an educated class in Odisha, Western educated class in Odisha. So that's in the other 2 novels, it dramatizes this process of the emergence of the educated Odia middle class, which is increasingly alienated from the traditions of Odisha, or traditions of their own world, and become increasingly alienated. But he doesn't, as I must mention here that it's not an entirely pessimistic picture, but he's trying to present a kind of transformation which has positive as well as negative sides, but he's interested in presenting a world in transition. So that's what he does. So before independence, Fakir Mohan's work of fiction, establishes the template, man's changing relation to land. But this, as we move on, as we move closer towards 1947 or the attainment of independence, other elements enter Odia fiction. For a very long time, people go on talking about how people got dispossessed of land, the rise of moneylenders. And that's one theme that permeates Odia fiction. So you'll have a number of novels which have land in its title, in their titles. But slowly things are changing. As cities emerge, as an urban middle class rises from the education system that had been put in place, you find novelists trying to explore other areas of human experience. New elements of sensibility are incorporated into fiction. For instance, one finds, say, psychological novels. In 1920s, you have a psychological novel, like The World Within or Monet Monet, where marital relations, marital discord, marital disharmony, these are explained or explored. And in 1926 or thereabouts, a very moving novel called The Dying Moon or Malajanna, The Dying Moon. It narrates or it depicts adulterous relationship. It's a moving relationship between a man and a woman, and the woman had to finally commit suicide because her love for this man can never be fulfilled because of the constraints, the social constraints they had to face, or they had to that militate against their relationship. So new themes are entering, like as I told you, psychological, the marital discord, marital disharmony, and this unfulfilled love. But so new elements are entering, new directions are being explored in Odia fiction. And as we move towards the independence, 1947, some novels also deal with the freedom movement, the struggles, but something very important happens. Around 1930s, because of the importance of the freedom struggle, because of the impact of Gandhi and Tagore, Odian novel takes a very important, you can see or can sense a change of direction. In another novel, say written about 30 years later by Kalindi Charan Panigrahi, who was at the beginning very deeply influenced by Tagore and later by Mahatma Gandhi, he writes a novel called Matira Manis. Again, the word, the operative word here is soil, born of the soil, Matira Manis. And in this novel, the world is the same, the kind of village that Fakir Mohan depicts in Samana Atagund. But the world has changed. You see a new sensibility making its presence felt. Here, for instance, the same story of greed for land, of a joint family and two brothers, and there is a conflict. A conflict arises over the ownership of land, that who would own this land. But because of the influence of Gandhi in this novel, the elder brother, because he had given the promise to his father that the land won't be partitioned, he leaves his family with his wife and two children. He leaves the family and goes away. So this is a new development which was made possible by the freedom struggle and the impact of Gandhi, and also the subtle influence of the Ramayana. Because you can see in this remarkable novel the impact of the story of Ramayana, in which Rama goes away, goes into exile, so that his father's promise can be fulfilled. So this epic theme is blended with the new sensibility created by the freedom movement and the influence of Gandhi. And later he writes a novel in which the protagonist, who left his family, abandoned his family property, he joins the freedom movement and goes to jail. So a new kind of renunciation. So suddenly renunciation is introduced as another theme in Odia fiction, something that we didn't find in the fiction, the works of fiction written by Fakir Mohan Senapati, where I think land was a source of tragedy. The new land policies created a lot of conflict and tragedies. So as we move closer towards 47, you find Odia fiction moving in an altogether different direction. Gopinath Mahanti writes Oraja. This is a very important moment in the history of Odia fiction, because up to this point, Odia fiction focused on either the Odia village or the emerging city, the urban world that was incipient. But now, Paraja was set in the tribal world of Odisha. Written perhaps published in 1945, just before independence, it talks about the exploitation of tribals and forest becoming property, nature becoming property. The colonial rules had transformed nature into property. The people who lived in the forest for centuries and thought that the forest belonged to them suddenly find that the forest, they don't own the forest. They are strangers there. and they'll be penalized if they cut down a tree. And their lives are completely upended. And finally, our tribal family is completely destroyed, and the main folk murder the moneylender. We have talked about the moneylender in Chamanatagund written in 1897. So the moneylender re-emerges in the jungles of Koraput, and there he destroys using British laws, which turn forest into government property or the property of the middle class, and these three tribals go to jail, killing the moneylender. So a new dimension is added to Odia fiction just before independence. And after independence, I think a major theme of Odia fiction is disillusionment. If you look at Odia fiction written after independence, the dominant theme is disillusionment at least for about 15, 20 years. Most of the novels are talking about the disillusionment generated by the post-independence world. So there is a powerful novel written by Surendra Mohanty. It was published in the 60s, Andha Diganta, the Blind Horizon. There he talks about the disillusionment of a generation after independence was attained. All those ideals which had inspired generations who left schools, gave up their studies, went to jail, suffered, their properties were confiscated. All these people who plunged themselves in the freedom struggle in the hope that there would be a golden dawn, suddenly felt terribly disillusioned. And some powerful stories and novels, especially this novel written by Surendra Mohanty, very famous writer. So that actually dramatizes, so that embodies this disillusionment. Some character, but very memorable characters present or they embody this sense of deep disillusionment with the ideals inspired by the freedom struggle. And then, of course, you find many Nara Kinnara by Santanu Acharya, which talks about life of the urban poor, and many novels even by Gopinath Mohanty, when he writes a novel after independence, it's about an acquisitive middle class. There is a very famous novel, it has been translated into English, Dana Pani, which is translated it as The Survivor and then Our Daily Bread. This again talks about the life of a clerk who is consumed by this ambition to rise to the top. It's a predatory middle class. It doesn't have any feeling for community. It's the kind of naked individualism which is trying to loosen community bonds. So it's the rise and rise of the member of a middle class who doesn't have any sense of belonging to a larger community. So this kind of unbridled individualism now is depicted by the novelists. And I talked about the disillusionment that was generated after independence and finds expression in the novels of Surendra Mohanty. And then, of course, I think many more works of fiction focused on these and new themes like the experience of women. There are novels after independence, they focused on the experience of women in a patriarchal society. Of course, the very famous novel is Amara Bhatta, which was made into a memorable film. And then Dalits, I have already talked about the depiction of the Adivasi tribal life, but then voices also came to be increasingly articulated in fiction. So recently, I think Akhil Naik, that has been published by, the English translation has been published by OUP, Oxford University Press. So Dalit voices also find expression in works of fiction written by younger people. So on the whole, I think Odia fiction after Fakir Mohan has taken many directions, and particularly after independence, I think it has moved in, as I told you, one of the dominant themes was disillusionment. Of course, the aggressive individualism of the emerging middle class, and then, of course, the experience of women and Dalits and Adivasis. So some good works of fiction have been written. They have explored facets of the changing experience of human beings living in the post-colonial or the post-independent India. People are experimenting with many forms and techniques. And I will end with talking about a couple of novels which I translated, and they dealt with themes that few other novels have. In the 1960s, Chandrasekhar Rath wrote a novel which expanded the scope of Odia novel to include the experience of mysticism. In very few Odia novels, because we began with Fakir Mohan Senapati, it was always the realistic world in which people are worried about land, people are worried about dispossession, people are worried about survival in a cruel world. So in very few novels, you had the experience of the mystical experience. Poetry, you had a long tradition of metaphysical pessimism in Odia poetry and the influence of Buddhism and all that. But in fiction was very worldly for a very long time. But only in a couple of novels before independence, you find characters becoming sannyasis when they're disappointed in love. But in Chandrasekhar Rath's novel, written after independence in 1960, the scope of Odia novel is expanded to include genuine mystical experience and the experience of renunciation. So somebody, a poor priest, temple priest, his wife dies, his son dies, and then slowly moves away from the world. And the novel ends with his almost mystical union with a kind of higher reality when he dies in Puri, has completely renounced the world. And so this is one one tendency which is a new experience that is embodied in Odia fiction. And there is another very interesting experiment with historical novel, with historical reality or historical facts. That was in 1990s, early 1990s, J.P. Das wrote a historical novel. It's a uniquely structured. It has a wonderful kind of structuring device he uses. A Time Elsewhere. I translated it as Time Elsewhere. The novel depicts the life lived in the decade after between 1858 to 1908, 50 years of history of Odisha, or more or less after the famine and the death of Radhanath Rai, the most famous Odia poet. So this novel adopts a very interesting narrative technique. It doesn't have a linear narrative. It doesn't have a single protagonist. It comprises. It's built out of fragments of biography. So it's almost like a kaleidoscope. One place, one moment of time, one person. Then in the next chapter, another person, another place, another moment of time. So over 450 pages, the novelist, through a kaleidoscope, is dramatizing a world changing under British rule, under new systems of law, under new systems of economic exploitation. And yet, the past is not romanticized. Change is dramatized without using melodrama or sensationalism. And the picture of a society slowly rising out of the wreckage of a famine, wreckage of the empire, that's presented most vividly. So these are some of the interesting experiments that novelists have conducted, and younger writers are, of course, writing about emerging issues. So broadly, that's how I would look at the broad picture of Odia fiction. I don't think I have said anything strikingly or radically new. I have just given very, very, what should I say? A picture. I've tried to give a broad picture of Odia fiction to the best of my ability. Hope I haven't tried your patience. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. If there are any questions, I would love to answer them.
Thank you, Jatin. Though he mentioned that this is a broad kind of survey. I know this is a huge task, difficult task for one to present the picture of the development, the evolution of fiction in Odia from the late 19th century to the present day, which is what Professor Naik has done in this very interesting and very thought-provoking, analytical lecture on Odia literature, on Odia fiction. I'm also happy to mention that some of the works that he has mentioned, especially as landmarks in Odia fiction, he himself has translated them into English. Fakir Mohan Senapati, for example, Chandrasekhar Rath, and I suppose J.P. Das also. You have translated into English, and I'm sure this rootedness in the text of the three novels, or the other novels as well, certainly can be seen in the way it has been presented, where the arguments have been organized, and thank you very much. It was a very, very wonderful kind of, experience to listen to this, what you call broad survey, but this deeply analytical, review of literature written over a century. I'm sure we have time for discussion. Are there questions or maybe
queries or or comments? I can benefit from comments as well.
Yes.
I'm Manoj.
Yes.
From Malayalam department. So the paper is very interesting. This time, I remembered that the Dalit novelist, one of the Dalit novelists, Naik, also you mentioned his name. One of his novels is named Veda. Veda translated from Odia to Malayalam. The name of the translator is T.P. Sajeevan. Madhurabhumi books also published it.
Bheda by Akhil Naik. Yeah.
Akhil Naik, yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm also wrote the study about this novel, also including my study in the book, Malayalam translation. Very thanks, sir. Very thanks.
Oh, good. Glad to know that this has reached the Malayalam, the readership in Kerala. So I'm glad to hear this. Yes. It's a fascinating novel. I strongly recommend it to the readers. Okay.
Shubha?
If I may.
Yeah, I'm sure you have, please.
Thank you so much, Jatin, for that wonderful exploration of the history of the Oriya novel. I always wondered if in many of the histories of the Indian novel, in many regions, whether in the early, as far as form is concerned, whether the early novels were more experimental than the novels written in the second stage. I would not say there were, again, experiments later, after these, maybe after the 60s perhaps. But somehow the second phase, this is, the second phase began to follow the Western novel, if not follow, but at least, the experimentations were not as intense, as in Fakir Mohan Senapati or in several Bengali novels, and where in other novels too, where you have a very open-ended sometimes when you do not have a linear structure, you have an open-ended form, you have various kinds of you have irony, you have humor, a lot of irony, you have a lot of humor, etc., etc. Which somehow disappears in the second phase. Do you think this is true of Uria fiction?
Yes, that was a very, what should I say? It's a very interesting point you made, Subha. I think the sense of being pioneers is no longer there. I think the early novelists, the novelists who wrote in the later half of the 19th century, they had this sense of, or in the 19th century, they had this sense of being pioneers. They're doing something new and excitingly new. I think the burden of Western influence was not crushing as far as, you rightly said that when we move to the later periods, I think a highly educated, westernized Indian middle class perhaps labored under an anxiety of influence that Fakir Mohan or Tagore or Bankim Chandra didn't experience. So rather than become liberating, I think the Western influence became a crippling kind of influence. So that may be, because even whenever I read Gora or I read Samana Tagunt, I can read them again and again and again, always discovering new layers of existence, their experience or significance. But when I read modern novels, after one or two readings, they cease to yield any new insight. So maybe there is a very vital point in what you say, but it needs to be explored more fully.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Sir, I am Divagar.
Yes, please.
The lecture was very interesting. Some interesting point. There are so many parallels between Malayalam literature and I can see from your. I know a little about Odia literature, but through your lecture, there are so many parallel events like the missionary writing right from the beginning, history. So the print media era, the textbook era, though the colonial, maybe the colonial experience were almost the same, except that great famine. Though the social life experience of people are different, the fiction is almost the same. The presence of narrator, various types of narrator, relationship between land and human being, the displacements, new legal systems, tribal life, Dalit life. It was very interesting. I want to point out that point.
Well, thank you. So I think if there aren't any more questions, we could call it a day. And thank you very much.
Jatin, can I just make a very brief comment, or maybe?
Please do, please.
Yeah.
Please do. Yeah.
Yeah, what I have noted about our literature, Malayalam literature, is that you have, especially in the late 19th century, you have a kind of course, you also in Parsi you perhaps mention about that, but a kind of language that that is meant to articulate not the emotions and the inner life of the individual, but articulate scientific matters. You have to interact with the objective reality and how the objective reality can be talked about. That becomes the primary concern of the writer, of the prose writer, and prose is introduced specifically for for sending messages, for example. You have a moral message to transmit. What happens in Bashir, for example, is that he doesn't look upon language in this way. He uses language in a that's why we in a reductive way we might say that he is using language creatively. Using language creatively is not the problem that I'm talking about, but the way in which language can be shaped in a non-scientific way. Key indicator of change of sensibility in the case of Malayalam literature. Does that kind of thing happen in other languages? I was interested in knowing that. And does it happen in Odia literature, for example?
Yes, I think that's again a very important point. There is always this tendency to standardize language, because the language of ordinary people, language of rustics, and the language of the educated. So in Fakir Mohan Senapati, there was an attempt to introduce the living idiom. And even in those days, there are people who were opposed to that. They wanted language to be more and more and more standardized, Sanskritized, the language of the Bhadralok, or language of the educated people. So that the playfulness is a very strong element, vital element in Fakir Mohan's fiction. But as you proceed, as you go through his later fiction, and as you watch the history of Odia fiction unfold, this playfulness takes a backseat. So language becomes more and more utilitarian or more and more standardized in the process. So perhaps in some writers you find elements of this playfulness, but generally speaking, the kind of Basir-like emphasis on living idiom, the playfulness, the subversiveness, that after Fakir Mohan, after a few writers, I think slowly takes a backseat, and modern Odia prose has become extremely standardized and earnest. It has lost its playfulness and its subversive quality. So this was a tendency which is now finally fulfilled itself or manifest itself. Okay, so that's how I would look at it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you don't have any other questions, maybe we can.
Sir, I'm Somanathan. Can you hear?
Yes, Soma.
Yes. I want to tell something about the last question by Dr. Ravindran. The standard language becomes very colloquial by the course of the history of novel. I think it's can be seen in a reverse order, because as Sir has described here, the prose and the text, when it came to existence by the Western influence, it was the way how to express the Western ideas in regional languages for vocabulary and the style, everything. They search for the Sanskrit words and Sanskrit style somewhat for the expression. And then it gradually become absorb the colloquial terms, vernacular idioms, everything to the standard language. By the way, we can see the print, along with the print media, we have the audio media like AI and everything like that. And the audio verbal language becomes very popular in the countryside. So that influenced the print media, and the transfer of vernacular idioms and vocabulary to the standard language become very fast. And nowadays, from tribal area, the poetry comes, articles comes, and all these enriches the standard language with their own words, and like that. Can we see it in a reverse way? Mere suggestion. What's your opinion?
I think Professor Ravindran can respond to that. I think we are, of course, with the arrival of print and all that, language gets standardized, orality is pushed to the background, and language loses some of its vitality, and we don't allow whole sections of society to get their voices heard because the way they speak. So we have developed a kind of standard language which excludes many other voices. So it's a duty of writers, I think, like Fakir Mohan did, or Basir did, or many other great writers did in India. They tried to introduce those voices, those linguistic registers into their writing, but increasingly I think we are witnessing a flattening out of fictionality. Yeah, Professor Rabindran.
Yeah, I think that is one way of talking about the change in sensibility that you have in fact narrated in your presentation. How, for example, in the recent days you have a number of new voices emerging in the fiction scene, and these could be described as departing from the standard language
Yes.
formula that perhaps.
So there is hope.
Yeah, that is
There
one
is
way of
hope.
looking at that. I
Thank
think
you.
that is what Professor Somanathan also has in mind.
Yeah, so there is hope. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for making that observation. Yeah. So I think.
So, Diva,
Okay.
shall we close? Why
Shall we?
don't you,
Okay, we can.
why don't you give a vote of thanks? to,
Yeah, you yourself do it, sir. You can. Please, sir.
Yeah. On behalf of the Vaikom Muhammad Bashir Chair and Department of Malayalam and Kerala Studies, I express our sincere thanks to Professor Jatin Kumar Naik for being with us today and for giving this thought-provoking essay, thought-provoking presentation on the fiction. Thank you very much. I'm also
Thank you so much. Okay.
yeah, thank my other colleagues in the Malayalam department who are present here. Special thanks to Professor Shubha Chakravarti for being with us today, and also the other participants from Calicut and elsewhere, I'm sure, who have joined us for this meeting today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.